Okay, I'm going to throw this open. Does anybody in the audience have a burning question that they'd like to ask? Ah, intrigued. You'd like to kick us off, okay?
Indeed, yeah. So I have a following question. This is pretty relevant for something I may start. It's pretty clear that on a macroscopic scale, on a scale of multiple centimeters, the structure of the brain is controlled by DNA. But what happens on a microscopic scale? Henry Markram published a paper where he said that if you have an axon here and a dendrite here, if they form connection and they're close to each other, fine. This is a random thing. The precise position of the neurons on a microscopic scale is random, and the connections forming is based on the activities. That's one side view. That I'm quoting Markram. On the other hand, we just saw this paper from Los Alamos, which reminded me very much of an electrical engineering precise circuit definition. So I'm curious to hear what the view is. Is it kind of random on the microscopic scale or not?
So, so my view, and I'm biased by working in a adult neurogenesis lab, but the integration, so that we have cases of, say, development that we can look at in adulthood. So we look at these stem cells that become neurons in adults. And they don't randomly connect. They're genetically instructed of how where they're going to grow their dendrites, where they're going to grow their axons. They get inputs from one layer of entorhinal cortex, which they go in a certain direction. Their axons go to certain neurons. The biophysical mechanisms that govern how those synapses form are all genetically encoded. You can look at the activation and inactivation of transcription factors as they mature that guides what happens. So I would say that DNA is controlling far, far more about the maturation and integration and circuit development, even at a single neuron scale, than people probably would like to admit. Now, it might look random because we don't know what those rules are, and it's certainly not that neuron 100, 500, and 1,582 is connecting to neuron 6,821. But it's going to be random at a much finer level of granularity than an 80-20 network or within a cortical column. I think there's far more DNA instructions, genetic instructions governing what is going on than, it's maybe not going quite to Andrew's extent, but it's a lot more than I think most theoretical neuroscientists are comfortable with.
Do you think Henry Markram is simply wrong?
I think he's oversimplifying or maybe over-interpreting from a handful of experiments.
Okay. Any other opinions on this?
Yeah, I'll take a contrarian point of view. With a background in material science, I'm familiar with a thing called dendritic growth, which I don't know which dendrites came first, but we call it dendritic growth too. And that is dictated by diffusions and concentrations, which are essentially stochastic. So the dendrites there, certainly, are growing in a random fashion. Similarly, dendrites and axons initially are growing. Are you saying that every branch point, every direction is in our DNA?
No. Well, so that's the thing. I think the conversation gets straw-manned between the two extremes. So certainly, the very specific connections, maybe where the spines come out of the dendrites, there's going to be some stochasticity there. But I would just say that, there's a study from Tonegawa about 10 years ago that was showing that, they'll have the spinogenesis where they will monitor spines in vivo and they kind of come and go. They come and go from the exact same spot in mature cells. There are certain hot spots, kind of like Loihi volcanoes in Hawaii, the little hot spots that Hawaii pops out of, that these hot spots are where the spines come and go from. So maybe they're located through some random process is part of it. I'm not saying there's randomness not part of it, but it's certainly not V1 is going to project get a projection from thalamus, and we'll draw that wire, and it's just going to be random through there. That is a vast oversimplification of cortical and neural development. So, and I mean, that's not what you're saying, but I think that is kind of an assumption by theoretical communities that I think it's an opportunity. I mean, let's dive into what those developmental rules are. We can get a lot.
I would agree that the gross routing, the white matter, says that this patch connects through the thalamus and eventually there's connections made to that patch. That's fine, I can understand that. But on the cellular scale, where these little fibers in filopodia are waving around in fluids, it's inherently stochastic.
But the types of neurons that join with each other are different classes of neurons.
Can you use the mic?
He said that
my hearing's not so good.
So he said the types of neurons are not, I mean, they're not arbitrary. And maybe I'll shut up in a second. But the other thing is it's not, I mean, these are not constrained, I mean, these are not free-flowing environments. The other aspect, and we have a talk about astrocytes, they govern quite a bit of where things can connect, and they have holes and pores and stuff. If you do an EM reconstruction of tissue, of like, say, spines intersecting with axons, there is no free space. It is very constrained where things can go and come and go. Terry Sinowski has these beautiful 3D stacks where he takes away, like, let's remove the astrocyte now, let's remove the axons now, and so forth. And you see this stuff is packed together. It's like a big giant game of 3D Tetris. So I think that, yes, stochasticity is part of it, but it is assuming that unknown complexity can best be explained by stochasticity at the scales we're talking about here. I think that is a missed opportunity for us.
Did you want to come in on this?
Not specifically on this, but just that I think that there's a lot of room for control structures to be potentially either pre-programmed, over evolutionary time, so to speak, and if you look at the structure of the brain, clearly not everything is cortex. You have basal ganglia, thalamus, and so forth. So, So I basically agree with Yulia's comment yesterday that there's a lot of room for runtime control of these systems.
Did you want to comment?
Yes, I don't know if that adds to the solution or the confusion. It's a paper published by Georgopoulos in 1982, and I might be wrong, like off 1 or 2 years. He recorded in John Hopkins from monkeys motor neurons as they were doing consistent movements, so the same movements. And he showed that if you look at a single neuron, you will not be able to decode the movement. But if you look at the cohort of neurons, they are actually working together to represent that movement in terms at least of direction. And after that work, there were other papers that followed. Now, if you go to the extreme, if you record a motor neuron in my cortex and you ask me to do the same movement a lot of times, every time I'm going to do the movement, you will see a different recording. But you would observe the same behavior. If you go at the in-between scale, going like between microscopic and the behavioral level, and you have an EEG sensor, you will see a consistent measurement. You will see the alpha oscillations that go away when I'm doing the movement, and then you will see the beta rebound right after the movement stops. So this is a consistent behavior of a system, not of a neuron, though. I don't know if that, again, I will stop with what I started saying. I don't know if that adds or actually.
Is language the case for stochasticity?
Yes, yes.
Julia wishes to join the
Actually, I
conversation.
would like to ask back. So why is that so important? Because I can imagine there can be stochasticity, but still either there's some projection into some space where you have invariance and predictable behavior.
Precisely.
In what sense?
Precisely. Okay. Right.
What about function, right? If we care about function.
Do you have a different question? You have a comment. Okay. You can't comment without a mic, though. Oh, that was a mistake.
But could there not be some sort of middle ground where there's a level of stochasticity and some sort of, in the middle, in between nodes? I mean, dynamic formation would be pretty reasonable case here, right?
The answer in any question in neuroscience is yes. It is stochastic and deterministic. It is, the far extremes and the middle ground. Yeah, I think that you're right. It is in between, and
To follow Julia's comment, so to follow on Julia's comment, if you concentrate your probability into a one value, you get a random value. It's just a matter of in which subspace you're projecting. So, sure, you can have randomness and still have a lot of structure. It's not, randomness just means that you can have different values, but that's not, yeah. Yes. Yeah, it's just a constraint matter.
I just wanted to repeat the comment I started making earlier. Lichtman did a electron microscope reconstruction, and found evidence that the mere proximity of axons and dendrites to each other is not sufficient to make the connection, that it's very type-based. So the neuroscience evidence doesn't support the idea that simply being in the same space makes a connection. It's also driven by the type of the neurons that source the processes. Yes, it's stochastic given that constraint.
Hey, I see an enthusiastic hand over here.
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to weigh in a bit to back up Brad. This is not an understudied phenomenon. This is an enormous amount of developmental and, to a lesser extent, adult neurogenesis-based neuroscience about sequences of pathfinding molecules and trophic factors that will guide axons and, to some extent, dendrites to specific locations in the brain. And there's even some funny evolutionary stories where, in a mammal, the route from here to here is actually this because a common tetrapod ancestor, that was a straight line, and then the trophic factor, this grew down, and the trophic factor sort of began to take a circuitous path. So there's an enormous amount of neuroscience on this. It does boil down to what we're all sort of converging on, that there are these incredibly structural architecture. That's why we all have brains that are wired up more or less the same way. There's definitely an activity-dependent last level, but again, even that activity dependence has structure. You have to have certain trophic factors, certain signals, and coactivity in a Hebbian synapse situation. So certainly you'll find stochasticity at some level of that. In a broader sense, you'll find activity dependence with stochastic components, but I just want to make sure that we don't get too overboard on just things that happen to cross by. In principle, axons really don't ever do anything interesting until you reach the end. Dendrites do.
Okay, I think we've probably exhausted that particular topic. It's an interesting discussion. Anybody got any other questions they'd like to ask? Yes, you need a microphone before you ask it, though. It's the rule.
Thank you. So if we are so particular about brain, then instead of 40 nanometer FinFET, shouldn't we be looking into self-assembly technique of assembling things and more towards synthetic biology, towards how to assemble these things, over going to some very fancy fab to fabricate these devices?
You should talk. That's what's the reason behind my question.
Oh, is it? Good.
This is the algorithms team up here. It sounds cool.
Given that I've got the 14 nanometer chip here, maybe I should defend our process. I mean, I think different members of this community have different kind of time frames and objectives and research ideas that they're really going after. For us, our choice of 14 nanometer is, we want to build things today that adds, value now. While this sounds fantastic, I'm pretty sure this isn't available in the next year or two. What you're describing is something maybe probably 20 years out until it's, actually ready for mass manufacturing. So for us, it's just a matter of we want to explore the architectural space, the support algorithms research, and figuring out what actually works, so that we can guide then these more advanced exotic techniques, which in the absence of existence proofs of this architectural set of features supports these sets of algorithms that actually solves these real world problems, we can spend lots of money and time exploring dead ends basically. So that's why we prioritize this today's manufacturing technology with mostly standard methodology.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of pragmatics here. I mean, there's a great deal of research going on into self-assembly in the sort of materials and nanoscience space, but we're mainly systems guys here, and we want to build things that actually work, okay? So we want technologies that work today, so we're not doing that, and we're not doing quantum. Oh, bad luck.
Hi, so one quick question from AI machine learning community. So we're neither hardware community nor actually neuroscience, but it's very hot and popular topic right now to come up with algorithms for automated development, say, of classical neural networks, not even spiking, but just good old ones, second generation. And there's always a good question. I mean, people are completely disconnected from neuroscience background, and they try various reinforcement learning approaches and heuristics to build better architectures, whether to do like neural evolution using genetic algorithms and stuff, or do, say, online adaptation of architecture and continual learning. And they're very kind of hot, important topics, but they completely lack those kind of intuitions about which constraints or what kind of, basically what regularization to put on their optimization. And I know it's a hard question because basically I'm asking you, out of all that knowledge encoded in DNA, which gives us very structured and very specific stochasticity, what parts of those constraints should we pay attention to first? Yeah, I know, I mean, easy question, piece of cake.
So as a footnote to the question, of course, the news out today was that this year's Turing Award has gone to three of the leading figures in mainstream machine learning: Jeff Hinton, Jan LeCun, and Yoshua Bengio. So you could phrase that question in the form, when's one of you guys going to get the Turing Award? but
a quick comment about at least, all of them, or at least, some more than others, especially Yoshua Bengio, is very interested in neuroscience-inspired approaches. But unfortunately, me too, and many other people, but when they start doing something neuroscience-inspired, the question is, how much it is inspired. So we need to learn more, but the question is, it's such a vast area. So I compare neuroscience-inspired AI with Tishby's information bottleneck. So you have a huge X of neuroscience, and you cannot come up with a compressed model M unless you maybe know which AI problem Y you want to solve. But still, it's totally kind of open question what constraints to import first, because they are more important. I don't even know if we can answer this question, but...
Well, I mean...
Okay, we'll have a go.
Given my talk previously, I'm obviously going to advocate for looking at frequencies. But, I mean, I think this is actually quite true. I mean, if you look at convolutional neural networks, for instance, I mean, it's a very signal processing old school style. It's just saying, look, neighboring pixels should be correlated because images, I mean, you don't have an object that is spread all over your visual field. In that sense, I guess that what I'm trying to say here is that you should use the constraints that you understand. I mean, as long as you know what this constraint does, why are you looking at this one, that's a good idea. As long as you're just saying, well, just because it's biologically oriented, I mean, that is not a constraint, and it may not be the reason why it's there. I mean, as you said, like the giraffe nerve, it's something that it's there because of historical reasons. It's not there for any optimality reason. There's no reason why you will have a nerve going down your neck and then up to your cheek. But there is a reason why neighboring pixels should be processed in a low-level features and build them up. So I guess that as long as you understand the reason, it's good.
So, Julia.
I mean, it's the same thing. It's just the spatial frequencies in the convolution. I'm just using frequency in temporal domain, but I mean, it's exactly the same thing.
Because temporal frequencies are kind of lacking from modern neural nets, unless you talk about spiking.
And anything temporal is lacking from modern neural nets.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely true. Yeah.
It kind of supports what I was kind of getting. I think, well, bringing time to AI would not hurt.
Time will be good. Let's give Julia a word. I mean, Julia's the only lady on the panel, you see. So I'm
what? Yeah, so I think the biologically inspired approaches, they're a little bit like kids. At some point, it's okay if they take off and develop according to their own logic. Depending on the application area, you might want to continue looking back in biology or not, right? So I think it's okay if they then develop, some method and depart from biological inspiration. Many machine learning techniques today, they are applied in data processing. Data processing is not something biological systems do very well. So I think it's only logical that then some things developed there which are not replicated from biology. If we're looking at robotics, in robotics we want to solve some tasks that biological systems seem to solve better. More flexible, more adaptive, can solve it all. So there probably we still have something to learn from biology, and it might be useful to also understand better how biology solves these tasks. So I think it depends on the application domain, and it's okay if these approaches, they get inspired in the beginning, but then they have their own logic, how they develop.
To add to Julia's comment, I think it's not always appreciated that the second component of the word neuroscience is science. And just like one cannot become a mathematician by reading a book, let's face it, the first chapters of a math book does not make him a mathematician. It's the same thing if we know and try to exploit, sometimes use, sometimes overuse notions from neuroscience. Most probably we are not serving neuroscience the way that we should be serving them. I don't know if I always have this question, and I'm echoing from last year's NICE conference, is whether we are smarter than machines because of spikes or despite spikes. And this is something we need to address because we are a spike-based community. What is the fundamental advantage that a spike gives to a network? Because up to now, I have the feeling that despite really promising results, what we tend to do because of this, including the Turing Awards, because of this avalanche of results from the traditional neural nets, is that we're trying to chase the tail of neural nets. So we try to convince them that we are as good as they are, and then try to find another advantage that would make us pop out a little bit compared to what they do. Is that the approach that we should be taking? Are we actually living in the and the engineers might actually understand the analogy better. Are we having the oscillations as we reach the plateau, the steady state in a step response system, and now we are going back and forth between what we need to do and what we can do? I mean, I don't know. I'm sorry for adding to your question even more questions, but I don't have answers.
Well, so I think Mike's got an answer.
Oh, okay.
Go on, Mike.
Well, there are answers there.
Yeah, I guess I was just going to make the point that it's, it's sort of, it feels strange and hard from, this community to give advice to the more mainstream AI community about, what constraints to use, because, that we're engaged in this very messy process of trying to figure out those constraints all the way down to the hardware architecture. And, one underappreciated property here is that the computer architecture you're using to actually run your models, run your algorithms, matters a huge amount. And so, so one constraint you may look at, which is obvious in real biology, is sparse connectivity. But, that doesn't help at all if you... Right. On the other hand, with the rise of new computer architectures, neuromorphic architectures that really natively support sparse connectivity well, then suddenly that constraint, really pays off, right? So I think that maybe generally one of the challenges in mainstream AI, despite all the success it's having, that's why I wouldn't necessarily advocate changing anything until sort of we figure out the right, next answer.
So what would you change?
Just to get more awareness of that full linkage of what's happening down at the hardware level, because I think that will allow you to make the judgment of what is the right constraint to look to, that can guide progress versus, this constraint has absolutely no benefit, for running it on GPUs or TPUs or something like that.
Okay, and I promised the answer as well. Okay, so at least there are three. It's not a bidirectional thing like Neuro AI. Now it's a triangle because hardware constraints. So my question was more actually to neuroscientists, because say if for now I even use standard hardware for algorithms and models, what can I get from neuroscience? I mean, that's kind of ongoing line of thought. But if you think also about implementing in hardware, then you will need additional constraints. So it's kind of overlap of constraints. But why? Okay, so to answer your question about, I know it's a hot topic, even like within our group and our department at IBM, about, say, spiking networks versus traditional ones. And everybody's asking question when they are useful. Is there something they would be better for than standard networks and so on? I guess the answer is if we stop comparing novel approaches on the old benchmarks and stop running those things on MNIST. I mean, MNIST is solved. Convolutional networks are very good match for images, at least image classification. Maybe we shouldn't be doing image classification. So the next question is, what type of benchmarks modern neural nets will be awful at? And neuromorphic will be better. So maybe we should try to come up with such benchmarks, and most likely those benchmarks will involve time. And it will be probably not very linear and highly coupled dynamical systems, something tells me. But what particularly in which application, I think that might be useful also not just for neuromorphic community, but also for AI, so they will be not so fixated on pattern recognition for decades. I think we need to work on those benchmarks.
Okay. I would like to take an issue with the statement that frequency is absent from modern neural network hardware. At least in the later neural networks, it features prominently in the synchronization of frequencies. However, the inspiration from that mostly came from just electronic circuit theory. Maybe we should have been inspired by neuroscience, but I confess I lack knowledge of how frequency factors in neuroscience. Obviously, it is important, but just it would be great if neuroscientists formulated how the frequency is important.
Anybody in the audience? Right, I've got two hands, okay.
Thanks. So just there's several instances in neuroscience where we care a lot about frequencies, where we refer here to subsets of neurons in a population that begin to have organized behavior in time with respect to each other. Probably the best known of these is sort of the communication through coherence ideas, which is when regions from disparate areas of the brain oscillate. In other words, you see field potential oscillations that are zero-phase synchronous with each other. Not for that direct reason, but for underlying reasons, it's thought that those are the situations in which those two networks are communicating reasonably, communicating directly. There's other more local intrinsic to circuit questions where input will initiate these sort of dynamic attractors within itself to create that network, that sub-network of organized in-time neurons that, at least in our way of thinking, are the ones that are actually doing work, despite the fact there's a lot of equally active but disorganized behavior from other neurons around them. And it works tremendously. So there's actually a lot of work in various contexts in neuroscience.
So that begs the next question. Why are there so many frequencies? I mean, we're running out of Greek letters. Are these frequencies that communicate between different parts of the brain doing orthogonal jobs? Is there something about one frequency for one function and different frequencies for other functions?
I think you want to answer.
So the broad answer is, yeah, we don't know yet. There are lots of narrow answers. So theta frequencies of 8-ish hertz come up when animals begin to move, when they begin to pay attention to particular tasks, those emerge. And you get, again, coherence between different areas of the brain specific to particular tasks and behavioral states. There's a phenomenon called phase precession in hippocampal networks where this is a relationship between this 8-ish hertz theta rhythm and a 50-ish hertz gamma rhythm in which spike times precess across gamma within theta. And so there's this complex network that seems to have a lot to do with trajectories through place fields, which is a whole other topic. But yeah, there's lots of individual areas where lots is known without being able to answer the general question. But, yeah, there's...
Can I ask something? Can I ask something back? Because I was always curious, which way is it around? So do things synchronize at a certain frequency and then they communicate? Or is it the other way around? Two things are coupled and that's why they are synchronized on a certain frequency. So do you couple because it's synchronized, or you get coupled for whatever reason and that's why you're in synchrony? Can you
So I think the actual reason you synchronize is because of communication, so because of transient coupling. I mean, that's the mechanism of it. The control system for why this and that suddenly becomes synchronized is the interesting part.
In fact, like for many degenerate states of the brain, like when you have anxiety or so on, you typically see that there's either too much oscillations that happen so that you couple fear with whatever it is. So it's fairly studied, just depends on the specific area which you're looking. But in principle, communication emerges through or because of oscillations rather than the other way around, typically, at least on adult mature brains.
What could neuroscience tell us about memory? Something more beyond hippocampus memory. That memory side must have many different pieces and parts and types and structures.
So as a former memory neuroscientist, which I don't do as much of now as I wish, I think the thing that there are a lot of careers looking at this thing, right? There's no one answer for it. But the thing I would say is there are a lot of different timescales involved. Timescales of dynamics involved, timescales of plasticity involved. And the thing that I think that is missing in AI, this kind of also gets to your question, and it relates to memory, is we tend to think we tend to pick one, maybe two timescales that matter in our algorithms and our applications, because it's hard to think about. These are parallel systems. They're already weird. You add spiking in there. Are you going to deal with 5 different learning timescales? It's weird, but that is what memory is. You have one-shot learning, maybe local in the hippocampus. It starts getting consolidated and strengthened using maybe random walk processes per a paper that came out a few weeks ago in the hippocampus. And then that eventually gets consolidated and it moves, but it doesn't move like one day. It moves over months, and it's like gradually moving. And so I think the time scales, the ability to kind of expand our thinking from just, okay, it's a recurrent net, let's try to do one-shot learning in a recurrent net. I think we need to have many different time scales, both in the mechanisms as well as in the understand the dynamics.
Okay, so I want to offer an intuition that addresses many of the topics we talked about over the last 10 minutes. I hope I can summarize this. There's questions about all these detailed phenomena like spikes and synchrony and oscillations and all this. But I think the deeper question was about, what does neuromorphic have to offer that the current mainstream machine learning isn't offering? And what can we And I think that goes back to biological inspiration. The question is, are there capabilities that the world wants that mainstream machine learning isn't providing? And so the idea is, if we can draw from biology the capabilities, then the capabilities will guide whether or not these phenomena are necessary. So let me offer two more thoughts on this, and I'll stop. One is, my intuition is that what we still need to learn from biology in terms of the detailed systems is what are the kinds of processing that various categories of cells are doing, how they're interacting with each other to produce the overall operation of the system. They're playing roles in some kind of neural circuit. They're getting work accomplished. They're different kinds of neurons because they need to do different things, play different roles in that circuit. And both the machine learning community and the neuromorphic community tends to focus on having very generic single type systems. So we need, I think, to get the greater capability, my intuition is we need to spread beyond that. And my final intuition, which is probably a little more controversial, is that once we figure out all those roles and actually get the algorithmic structure built, that things like oscillations and spike may turn out not to be really relevant. It may be that you could do it with a floating point and you'll be fine. Although I suspect along those lines that the lower, something less than 32 bits is probably going to be sufficient.
So I agree first that there are these two levels. One very mechanistic level with different mechanisms that we could still learn from biology. And then the other one is more macroscopic level. What are we still lacking in machine learning, what biological systems do? So I have an answer to this second part, which was the first part in your question. So I think one thing that is missing is autonomy of behavior. Making these decisions, where to move, how to parameterize the movement, if we are in this behavioral paradigm, seen in robotics, making decisions of where to go and what to do. If you look at the most advanced robots, let's see these locomoting robots, like the big dog. So there are some they do really nice dynamics. If you watch them and they look like a real dog, all the movements are so biological. But in the corner, of some videos, you see this guy who is actually controlling where to go. So all these decisions, they're usually off the system, the artificial intelligence system, and with a human. And then autonomy of the learning process. All deep networks, what they're missing is autonomy of the learning process. It's the training procedure, right? I have to prepare the data. I have to mix it around, right, to not have batches of the same class. I have to massage the data for so long. I have to design the whole procedure, how I present the data, then read out the output, then compute the error, then I backpropagate. It's completely non-autonomous. And biological systems, they learn differently. So there we could learn something, and it seems to be a useful thing, right? Because we want different training procedures for these networks.
Okay, I'm going to sort of change direction a little bit here.
May I?
Mihai, you okay? Yeah, I'll just give you warning, right? I'll let you give your response.
So
what
I was going to answer the questions over there.
I'm going to let you answer the question, but I want to just give everybody warning that when you've answered the question, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of you give you 1 minute to say what you think is the most important takeaway from today, okay? So the reason I want to give you warning is because somebody's got to go first, and I want to give them a little bit of time to think about it. So anyway, back to the previous topic, Mihai.
I was gonna answer the question, but I'm not, because I got triggered for the second time today. You triggered me once during your talk. So you said that machine learning approaches don't take decisions, but I mean, we've seen machines beat, the best humans at, you name it, Go, StarCraft, Dota. What's wrong with these things? I mean, obviously they have to take decisions there, and they're doing it really well.
So first is like in all these games, it happens in a very restricted, nicely formalized space of states and actions that someone has prepared for the machine. Like very
huge, by the way, in StarCraft.
It's huge, definitely, but very clearly structured. Still not comparable with the space that a baby has in its child's room. It's like qualitatively different. You have this continuity thing, right, where you have to make decision, like even in a color, where do I set my categories? This is the big thing that the system needs to do. So these decisions, which I mentioned, which I think are lacking, are on a bit lower level of granularity in a way. This is one thing. The second thing, the network, like behind the Go and all the other games, was trained. So now it's a mapping. It's a mapping from input to output. You could say it makes decisions, but this is fixed, right? So this is fixed in the way how it arrived to the structure, but required a lot of training and kind of hand tuning, you could say, so preparing the data for you to be able to do. So we shouldn't argue about the terms, what is decision, if what and not, but the quality of decisions in these games is different from the quality of decisions that we take like in every minute to minute. Now, when I want to grasp this bottom with this bottle.
Okay.
It's something the machine won't be able to do, but you have a comment to that.
No, okay, right.
Oversimplified view of modern AI, but you got, okay, so those systems are not necessarily fixed, and they being retrained on other games, and they can do something, so it's not just like, what you're describing used to be. So recently there is lots of activity on learning to learn in AI, and this is old topic. Anyway, so I was looking forward to the talk with that name, but unfortunately Conrad wasn't here, learning to learn. But we're on that spectrum. So we are not anymore at completely fixed systems, and people are working in that direction, but we're still far from lifelong, continual, multitask, transfer, learning, and true generalization. So,
Okay.
yeah, so that's a problem.
Okay, right. Now we're going to do what I said, right? I am in charge in case there's any doubt here. Who would like to, and I'm going to go sequentially because otherwise I'll never remember who's had a turn. Who'd like to go first? You're ready, are you? You're ready. So you have 60 seconds, and it's important that we stick to 60 seconds because there are 13 of you, and we have to finish and go for dinner at 15:15. Okay, so I've timed this very carefully. So your 60 seconds starts now.
Okay, I'll keep it short. So I think one big takeaway from the discussion here is that the need for a grand challenge of some sort for the neuromorphic community is a large one, and that's come up already. But if the community could kind of coalesce around a particular problem, that would be a proof point for showing where you're getting a clear benefit by adopting a neuromorphic model of computation in comparison to standard machine learning approaches. And my own bet is for something involving continuous control, but I'll leave it at that.
Very economic with your 60 seconds. A good example to follow.
So the reason I think I had the visceral reaction to Winfried's comment to start is that I really think that, Julia said it perfectly, and I think we had an example in the olfactory talk as well, where the advantages of neural circuits, neural algorithms, are very likely going to come from very specialized circuits, from very particular architectures that the brain uses to solve very particular problems. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not a generic recurrent net or feed-forward net or whatever, and let's train it. There's a lot of baked-in capabilities that the brain is sitting there waiting to give us if we only have every talk at NICE be like Julia's and olfaction.
Okay, Mike.
I guess my takeaway is I was thinking back to the first NICE I attended, which was 2016, and there was a lot more kind of debate. Like the discussion has been pretty civil in these panels, right? And so there's actually maybe a little bit of convergence that we're seeing in this field. Where the talks are more about this algorithm is working, and this is what I'm able to do, and much more so. And I think we're seeing genuine progress in this field over the past few years, and I find that very exciting. We're not to the finish line, but there's genuine progress. And robotic foosball was the grand challenge, by the way. Greg Cohen can tell you all about it.
Okay, as a hardware guy, I would say that my takeaway will be that what the neuromorphic community can do is constrained by what is available in terms of hardware, and maybe when hardware make progress, we'll be able to get new ideas as well and new implementations in the future.
Okay.
Yeah, my comments about robots also. It's been mentioned several talks during the day, and it's sometimes peripheral and it's sometimes on the mark, that we need an embodiment to have true intelligence. We've got to be able to make decisions in an environment, and I think the only way to do that is with real robots.
Okay.
So my takeaway was similar to others, I guess, to see this complexity of the brain and many nitty-gritty details and specific structures that we can still extract from biological systems and learn from them, from astrocytes, and also when people develop theoretical models. So I guess that would be the main message. We still have enough to learn from the brain.
Okay, so I'm going to use my time to answer the questions that I promised I was going to answer before. You can call it a takeaway. So first of all, you asked about the killer application for neuromorphic hardware. And I think I gave an answer at the end of my talk. So where are we building brain-inspired systems in order to understand brain-inspired algorithms and models? I mean, this is clearly an excellent application. People all over the computational neuroscience community are looking for efficient substrates for emulating their models and testing their hypotheses, right? So this is the substrate for this kind of research, to echo what Mike said. And the other point that you mentioned, I like to turn the question a bit on its head. So you suggested searching for benchmarks where neuromorphic backends would excel. I'm not sure that this really makes sense. A benchmark is whatever it is. A benchmark for autonomous driving is an obstacle course. A benchmark for StarCraft is StarCraft, right? So, right, but the problems, we shouldn't define problems by the systems with which we want to solve them, right? So. Okay, so to make it short, give me 10 more seconds. So. I think that we can, by testing our ideas inspired by biology on these substrates, we can extract individual aspects of biological dynamics, again, to remind you what I said in my talk, right, that may be helpful for someday for machine learning applications.
Okay. I'm from neuroscience field, and when I build some model of some theoretical or computational model of the neuroscience, we usually try to reproduce some behavior or electrophysiological result of the actual real animals or real neural network, real brain neural networks. So it's the experimental data acts as some sort of benchmarks or justification. So I basically agree with the benchmark arguments. We need actually a benchmark for neuromorphic chips, and yeah, that's one thing. And I was a bit surprised when this is my first time to come to a nice workshop, and I was really surprised that analog computers were very influential in this workshop, because the history of the computer is a battle between the analog computer versus digital computer, and digital computer won, right? So, yeah, I'm very looking forward to seeing the future of the analog versus digital arguments in this field, in the field of neuromorphic computing. Thank you very much.
So I would say that the main target for a neuromorphic computing is where AI is failing. And don't get tricked by videos on YouTube. I might be biased, but at least the field of robotics, in the field of robotics, AI is failing miserably. If you ask a system to operate in an open environment in real time, most probably it will fail. And I think spiking neural nets, by having that notion of time, is actually gives at least an advantage that someone should at least pursue further and at least search whether this is going to be realized, this promise is going to be realized or not. The other thing I want to say is that I'm really excited that I'm among like a community that is wide and at the same time compliant and keeps asking itself whether what we do is important, and I haven't seen that. I've been to many communities, including robotics. We all roboticists believe that they're doing a great job, which is good, but it's also a maturity principle for people to actually ask what they do is actually important or not.
So I work kind of half in neuromorphic computing and half in quantum computing. And quantum computing has a killer app. It's got a few of them, and it has no hardware. Or at least hardware that's crawling. Neuromorphic computing has hardware, but as people have said, maybe no killer app. I think grand challenges are good ideas. And I think that the sort of thing along the lines of what people have been talking about in terms of time-dependent things is a robot that can, skip and whistle at the same time. So in other words, along with what I was talking about today, I feel that control systems are, I'm just talking about the same thing all the time, but control systems are important. You need to be able to deploy different kinds of learning, potentially different behaviors. And it's well known, if you just look at the cognitive neuroscience literature, that, the brain does this all the time, very fluidly, very facilely. And so I think that for a grand challenge, that's a sort of direction to head in.
I would like to continue echoing the theme of the grand challenge. But what there is a temptation, it seems to me, that to formulate the grand challenge that AI should do what humans do even better. That, in my opinion, won't be too productive because it's not achievable and people cannot rally behind this goal. At the same time, whenever I speak about, for example, the ImageNet challenge, image recognition, nobody wants to talk about that. It's a solved problem, old hat. But there was a good thing about that, that it was a very measurable and bounded and achievable problem. So then, in my opinion, it would be great to formulate an intermediate challenge rather than a grand challenge of the same type that people can rally behind and achieve. It doesn't have to be too general, it just needs to be achievable.
Thank you.
I guess that I'm going to go into Julia's direction and say that somehow the thing that we have here is a bunch of engineers who would actually tackle one problem, try to put an structure for one particular problem, as opposed to going to a machine learning conference where you hear often enough that, we're just going to approximate everything with just having deeper networks, or that somehow there's a notion of understanding that I feel it's lacking at least in practitioners of machine learning, maybe not in people who would actually spend too many hours with it. So I think that somehow the fact that we're trying to embody things or to build hardware or to build some structure that we somehow understand to a certain level what it does, it's quite an asset of this community.
Thank you.
So I've heard some talk about benchmarks yesterday and then benchmarks today, and I think that is a very important topic. But as a I guess as a convert from the machine learning community, I think there's a double-edged sword that comes with benchmarks, and that is so when I was at the Naval Research Labs, David Aha coined this the Michael Jackson effect of neural networks, and that is you have a benchmark, you tweak something here, you cut something out there, you add something here, and all of a sudden you have sort of this Frankenstein network where all of the sort of biologically beautiful stuff has been removed. And so I sort of encourage that I like this community. I encourage this community to not make the same mistake when it comes to benchmarks, and to be free to experiment and not just try to sort of beat the state of the art.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're coming to the point in the program where we want to start putting our coats on and heading back to Zen for the conference dinner, which starts at 6:30. So that's just under 20 minutes away. So I think I'll wrap this session up at this point. I'll thank the speakers very much for their thoughts. And wish you all a pleasant dinner. Thank you very much.